Some people don't argue to understand. They argue to dominate, to bully, to drag you down. Let's be honest, some arguments don't just waste your time. They drain your sanity. You walk in hoping for understanding, clarity, maybe even connection. But 5 minutes in, your blood pressure is up, your patience is gone, and you're questioning how this even started. That's not growth. That's psychological warfare dressed up as conversation. We've all been there, caught in the middle of a debate that slowly mutates into something uglier. It's no longer about ideas or truth. It's about dominance, about ego, about who can shout louder, jab harder, twist words faster. You start off discussing something logical and end up defending your character, your past, maybe even your worth as a human being. And for what? This is where Stoicism draws the line. The Stoics were brutally clear about one thing. Not every battle is worth fighting. Not every provocation deserves a response. And not every voice deserves your energy. Seneca warned us that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. But when you argue with someone who refuses to reason, you suffer in both. Because the person in front of you doesn't want the truth. They want to win. Or worse, they want to wear you down until you walk away defeated, just so they can feel victorious. So let me ask you something directly. How many hours of your life have you spent trying to explain something to someone who wasn't even listening? How many arguments have ended with you frustrated, not because you lost, but because you realized you were never in a real conversation to begin with? The harsh truth is this: some people aren't debating, they're performing. They don't want to understand. They want attention, control, validation. And if you don't see the warning signs early, you'll find yourself trapped, arguing with someone who confuses emotion for evidence, volume for truth, and personal attacks for insight. But there's a better way, a Stoic way. In this video, we'll break down 6 clear signs that you're arguing with someone who simply isn't worth the toll it takes on your peace of mind. Each one is a red flag, a signal to step back, protect your clarity, and walk away with your dignity intact. Because mastering the art of disengagement isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And the Stoic doesn't argue to win. He argues, if at all, to understand. If that sounds like the kind of discipline you need in your life, like this video, subscribe to True Stoic Way and drop a comment below. I choose clarity over comfort. Let's begin. Sign 1. They confuse volume with truth. There's a certain kind of person who thinks raising their voice is the same as raising their intelligence. You know the type. The second you challenge their opinion, boom, the volume spikes, logic disappears. And now you're not in a conversation anymore. You're under verbal assault. They don't explain, they don't clarify, they don't ask, they bark. It's not about ideas, it's about intimidation. And if you're not careful, you'll find yourself getting louder just to be heard, just to defend yourself against a storm of noise that was never about truth in the first place. That's the trap. Because here's the dirty trick. Volume works. It works not because it's right, but because it overwhelms, because it activates something primal inside you. A threat response. Your body tenses, your heart races, your instinct says stand your ground, match their energy, don't let them dominate you. And just like that, the argument is no longer about clarity. It's about survival. I've seen it in boardrooms. I've seen it in marriages. Hell, I've seen it on street corners where 2 grown men start off disagreeing about parking space and end up inches from each other's faces, screaming like animals. Why? Because one of them mistook loudness for logic and the other took the bait. Stoicism doesn't play that game. The Stoic understands that the louder you get, the more you've already lost. The moment you abandon reason for noise, you've admitted weakness. And if you mirror that behavior, if you raise your voice to meet theirs, you've just surrendered the high ground. You've let someone drag you into the mud and call it debate. Marcus Aurelius said, raise your reason, not your voice. That's not poetry. That's a tactical strategy. Because when someone starts shouting, the Stoic goes quiet, not because he's scared, but because he refuses to turn truth into a shouting contest. Let me be brutally honest. Shouting is a performance for people who have nothing to say. It's emotional coercion dressed as strength, and it fools far more people than it should. People back down, not because they agree, but because they don't want the heat. They nod just to make it stop, and the loud one walks away thinking they've won. But what did they win, really? A fake agreement? An empty silence? This is where the Stoic draws the line. He doesn't reward noise with attention. He doesn't stay in conversations that have turned into power struggles. He knows that when logic dies, volume rises. And when volume rises, it's time to cut the mic and walk out of the circus. Let me give you an image. You're in a burning room. The walls are closing in. Smoke is everywhere. Someone inside is screaming at you to argue with them about why it's on fire. You don't yell back. You walk out. That's the Stoic approach to a shouting match. You don't meet their energy. You master your own. Because power isn't found in how loud you are. It's found in how little you're provoked. And for men, especially men who've spent years being told to be strong, assert yourself, never back down, this is a hard lesson. We're conditioned to see withdrawal as weakness, to think walking away is surrender. But that's the lie, that's the bait. The truth is, it takes more strength to stay calm in chaos than to contribute to it. It takes more courage to be silent in the face of a scream than to scream back. Because here's what you have to remember. The one who screams is already out of control. They're not defending truth. They're defending their ego. And if you get sucked into that, you lose your own control. You start throwing verbal punches instead of presenting ideas. You start performing instead of thinking. And once you're performing, you're not stoic anymore. You're just another man yelling to be heard. Don't be that man. The Stoic holds the line. He speaks clearly. He doesn't repeat himself just to sound right. He lets the truth stand without fireworks. Because real arguments are not battles of lungs. They're battles of ideas. And if the other person has none, let them shout alone. Because here's the final punchline. A fool thinks noise makes him powerful, but power never needs to raise its voice. And when the shouting stops working, when they realize their noise can't shake your calm, they'll escalate, not in volume this time, but in venom. And that brings us to the second sign. When volume fails, they stop attacking your argument and start attacking you. Sign 2, they attack you, not the idea. So you stayed calm. You didn't raise your voice. You held your ground with clarity and reason. And what happens next? They drop the mask. When someone realizes they can't win the argument with logic, they pivot to something uglier, you. They stop addressing what you said and start going after who you are. Suddenly the topic is no longer your point, it's your character, your past, your tone, your supposed intentions, your credibility, your qualifications, even your personal life. Anything they can weaponize to knock you off center. Make no mistake, this isn't debate, this is deflection. It's not about proving their point, it's about provoking you. Because if they can get you emotional, if they can push you into defending your reputation instead of your reasoning, they've already won. Not on logic, but on manipulation. And it works. Because most of us, especially men who've spent years building our integrity, don't take personal attacks lightly. We feel the heat rise, the jaw tighten. The urge to respond is almost primal. You don't get to question me, but that's the trap. The moment you switch from the argument to your ego, they've hijacked the conversation. You're no longer discussing truth, you're defending your pride. Here's the Stoic truth. Only the weak attack the person when they can't attack the idea. That's not just a sign of intellectual failure, it's an act of surrender. They've thrown in the towel on reason. Now they're just swinging blindly, hoping something lands. You don't have to swing back. Epictetus said, it's not the insult that harms you, but your judgment that it is insulting. In other words, an insult only lands if you let it. And why should you? Why should you hand over your emotional state to someone who's already lost the argument? You think staying calm means being passive, oil? No, it means being in complete control. It means looking your opponent in the eye and saying, without saying a word, you can't drag me into your mess. I've seen grown men fall into this trap and lose everything. Debates that started over business strategy end with personal grudges. Marriages that began with "we need to talk" dissolve into screaming matches about who always does what wrong. And every time the same thing happens. One side runs out of logic, the other side takes the bait, and suddenly it's war. But Stoicism? Stoicism is the art of refusing that war. You stay on the idea. You hold the line. You don't respond to insults, because insults are a distraction. And you don't let someone else's insecurity become your emotional burden. It's not easy. When someone questions your values, your motives, your intelligence, it hits hard. But a Stoic doesn't flinch. Because he knows if the idea was so wrong, they would have just disproved it. But they couldn't, so they attacked you instead. That's not strength, that's desperation. Let me be clear, when they start attacking your character, it's not proof you're wrong, it's proof they're cornered. And that's why you don't stoop to their level. You don't throw back insults. You don't start listing your credentials like a politician under fire. You don't try to prove your decency, because the second you do, you're no longer speaking from power. You're defending from insecurity. And that's not Stoic. The Stoic recognizes the moment someone crosses that line and chooses not to follow. He doesn't escalate. He doesn't retaliate. He simply holds his position and lets the other person unravel themselves. Because that's exactly what they're doing, exposing their weakness by how they fight. Seneca said it best, anger is temporary madness, and nothing makes people angrier than realizing they're losing. So they lash out, not to persuade you, but to provoke you. They don't need to be right, they just need you to lose your cool. Don't give them the satisfaction. Because there's real power in restraint. There's real strength in composure. And in today's world, where outrage is currency and humiliation is entertainment, the man who keeps his dignity in conflict is the rarest, most dangerous kind of man. Not because he dominates, but because he doesn't need to. So next time someone comes at you personally, don't explain, don't defend, don't engage. Stay still, stay calm, and if necessary, walk away. Let them scream into the silence. Let them win the argument no one else was watching. Because here's the hard Stoic truth. It's better to lose your pride than lose your peace, but it's even better to lose neither. And when you've mastered that kind of emotional control, when you refuse to be pulled into the muck of personal insult, you're ready for the next battle. But what if you stay calm? What if you remain respectful? And still, they won't budge. They refuse to change their mind. That's the third sign, and it's the one that wastes more time than all the others combined. Sign 3, they never change their mind. There is nothing more exhausting, nothing more soul-draining than arguing with someone who is absolutely, defiantly incapable of changing their mind. You bring evidence. You bring clarity. You lay the facts on the table like a surgeon presenting x-rays. And what do? They shrug. They repeat what they already said 5 minutes ago, word for word, like a loop that doesn't recognize the input, only playback. You're not in a dialogue, you're in a monologue with a brick wall. And if you're still hoping for some breakthrough, some shift, some glimmer of self-awareness, I have news for you. It's not coming. Because this kind of person doesn't debate to refine their thinking. They debate to protect their identity. To them, admitting they're wrong isn't an intellectual correction, it's an existential threat. They see change as weakness and flexibility as surrender. So they double down, then double down again. Even when every shred of logic is working against them, they cling to their opinion like it's life support. And here's the thing, you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. That's where most of us go wrong. We think if we're calm enough, if we're clear enough, if we lay it out just right, they'll finally say, you know what, you're right. But that moment never arrives, not because your point isn't valid, but because they are not capable of receiving it. They're not listening to you. They're listening to the voice in their head that says, don't back down. Don't look weak. Don't let them win. It's not about truth. It's about ego. And the ego fears correction more than it fears being wrong. Seneca said, while we teach, we learn. But people like this aren't here to learn, and they're certainly not here to be taught. They're here to survive the conversation with their self-image intact, no matter how many mental gymnastics it takes. And the longer you engage with them, the more you waste not just time, but energy, clarity, and peace of mind. You start repeating yourself. You start getting frustrated. And worst of all, you start thinking maybe if you just say it one more way, it'll land. But it won't, because you're not arguing with a thinking mind. You're arguing with a fortress of insecurity. That's where Stoicism saves you. A Stoic doesn't try to break down brick walls with willpower. He doesn't confuse patience with martyrdom. He knows when a person has shut the doors of perception and bolted them from the inside. And instead of pounding on those doors until his knuckles bleed, he walks away intact. Not out of arrogance, out of discipline. Because he understands, wisdom isn't in winning every argument. It's in knowing which ones to avoid entirely. If someone won't budge after being shown the truth, then they're not defending a position. They're defending a fantasy, and the Stoic refuses to join them in it. He doesn't hurl insults. He doesn't grow louder. He simply recognizes the futility of pushing further. It's like trying to pour water into a cup that's already full and sealed shut. Let me be clear. Refusing to change one's mind in the face of clear evidence is not strength. It is fear masquerading as conviction, and you will never liberate someone who is chained to the comfort of being right, even if it means being wrong forever. So stop trying to be their savior. Stop treating logic like a battering ram. Your role isn't to rescue those who have no intention of moving forward. Your role is to protect your peace, to guard your focus like it's sacred, because it is. Some arguments aren't real, they're performances. And some people don't want dialogue. They want to be unchallenged, even when they're dead wrong. Don't stand there hoping for change from someone who fears growth. Don't bleed your clarity into their chaos just because you think it's the noble thing to do. It's not noble, it's naive. A Stoic doesn't chase validation from those who can't offer it. He speaks once, maybe twice. Then, if the message falls on deaf ears, he retreats. Not in defeat, but in wisdom. Because you can't teach a man who refuses to learn. You can't debate someone who sees concession as death. And you can't win against an opponent who isn't playing for truth, but for ego. That's not a conversation. It's a trap. And the Stoic, he refuses to step in it. Because once you've seen the stubborn heart of someone who won't change, once you've recognized that the real barrier isn't intellect, but fear, you're ready to identify the next manipulation they use. When facts don't work, they reach for feelings. When logic fails, they weaponize emotion. And that's the fourth sign. Sign 4, they use emotion as evidence. There comes a moment in certain arguments, after logic has failed, after stubbornness has cracked but not collapsed, when the other person, sensing they are cornered, makes one final desperate move. They reach for emotion. Not emotion as an honest expression of humanity, not vulnerability born from truth, but emotion carefully deployed as a tool of manipulation. They abandon the idea entirely and offer you not a counterpoint, but a performance. Trembling voice, wounded eyes, an accusation disguised as injury. You're making me feel attacked. At first it disorients you. You were discussing something rational, policy, evidence, principle, and now you find yourself defending your tone, your kindness, your moral character. You're no longer debating, you're apologizing, and you didn't even notice when the shift happened. That's how subtle and effective the tactic can be. Because decent people, people who are self-aware, people who care about the impact of their words, tend to flinch when someone says, "That hurt me." It hits something primal, especially in men raised to protect, to fix, to hold space for others. You don't want to be cruel, you don't want to be careless, and in that flicker of hesitation, you become vulnerable. Not to truth, but to distortion. This is the core of the tactic. Emotional appeal used as a bludgeon, not a bridge. It's not meant to deepen understanding. It's meant to shut down the conversation entirely, to make you feel like the villain for simply having a perspective that discomforts someone else. And if you're not vigilant, you'll backpedal. Not because you're wrong, but because you have been guilt-tripped into submission. The Stoic does not fall for this. He does not dismiss the emotional reaction, but he refuses to confuse it for proof. He recognizes that feelings, while real, are not self-validating. They reflect one's internal processing, not the external reality. Or, as Epictetus put it best, it's not things that disturb us, but our opinions about them. What this means in practice is brutally simple. Just because someone is upset doesn't mean you did something wrong. And just because your words triggered discomfort does not mean your reasoning was flawed. A Stoic sees the distinction clearly. He honors the presence of emotion, but not its tyranny. The truth, no matter how gently spoken, can still offend. The clarity you bring may threaten someone's sense of certainty. Your refusal to nod along politely might rupture the illusion they have clung to for years. That's not aggression, that's growth. And real growth is rarely comfortable. In today's culture, where sensitivity is currency and offense is often treated as injury, this discipline becomes even more vital. We are told to tiptoe, to disclaim, to dilute. We are trained to prioritize comfort over honesty. But the Stoic sees that for what it is: moral cowardice disguised as compassion. Because pretending you agree just to keep someone from crying is not empathy. It is lying. It is enabling. And worse, it is the slow erosion of your own integrity. Stoicism does not demand coldness. It demands clarity. The Stoic is not unfeeling. He simply refuses to be governed by someone else's reaction. He doesn't need to shout to be firm. He doesn't need to insult to be honest. He speaks truth cleanly, even when that truth is difficult. And if the listener cannot separate their feelings from the facts, the Stoic knows that is not his burden to carry. He remains steady. He does not grovel. He does not coddle. And most importantly, he does not abandon the point to chase the ghost of emotional approval. Because once you do that, once you let someone else's discomfort override your discipline, the conversation is no longer about ideas. It becomes a performance, a negotiation not of logic but of fragility. And every step you take to comfort their emotional state comes at the cost of your clarity. I've seen it play out in conference rooms, in relationships, in public debates. One person raises a valid concern. The other looks offended, not because the point was cruel, but because it touched a nerve. The room shifts. Attention leaves the idea and turns to the person who feels hurt. Suddenly, the original issue is forgotten, buried under a pile of affirmations, reassurances, and damage control. And the truth, it gets swept aside like it was never there. This is not discourse. It is manipulation wrapped in vulnerability. And if you allow it once, you invite it every time. You reward the behavior. You teach people that the path to controlling you is not argument, but emotion. The Stoic refuses that path. He speaks once, twice, maybe 3 times. If the response is tears or offense or theatrical pain instead of reason, he doesn't escalate. He doesn't explain himself into oblivion. He recognizes that clarity is not always comfortable and comfort is not always truthful. He holds the line because he knows that a man who cannot tolerate emotional noise will never stand for intellectual courage. And a man who fears hurting feelings more than he fears compromising truth will end up betraying both himself and the people who trusted him to speak honestly. The Stoic respects emotion, but he does not submit to it. He does not confuse the tremble in a voice for a flaw in the argument. He does not assume that discomfort equals wrongdoing. He does not recoil from truth simply because someone else lacks the resilience to receive it. Because once you accept that weaponized emotion is not a call for empathy, but a tactic to silence you, you take back your voice. And if that tactic fails, if the manipulation doesn't land, if your clarity remains unshaken, they escalate one more time. They reach for chaos. They start changing the subject. They flood the conversation with irrelevance. And that is the 5th sign. Sign 5, they derail with distractions. When emotion fails to silence you, when tears and trembling tones can no longer hijack the truth, there is one tactic left in the manipulator's playbook: chaos. It doesn't always show up in rage or collapse. Sometimes it arrives subtly, cleverly, even with a smile. One moment you're discussing a clear point, an idea, a principle, a decision that needs scrutiny, and the next you're knee-deep in unrelated grievances, old arguments, or some absurd hypothetical that has nothing to do with the issue at hand. They don't answer the question. They introduce a dozen others. They don't refute your point. They change the subject entirely. They don't want resolution. They want confusion, because confusion protects them. It buys time. It wears you down. It scatters the focus so thoroughly that, before long, neither of you remembers how this argument even started. That's the goal. When someone can't win with logic, and they can't silence you with emotion, they try to bury you in irrelevance. It's not a mistake, it's a tactic. They resurrect ancient conflicts. They bring up something you said 5 months ago in a different conversation, under different circumstances. They question your phrasing, your tone, your choice of words. They drag you from the clean field of ideas into the swamp of psychological warfare. You think, at first, it's just a detour. You try to pull the conversation back on track. But every time you redirect, they shift again. Every time you anchor, they deflect. And soon, your clarity is no longer sharp. It's diluted by all the noise they've wrapped around it. Here's what the Stoic sees. This is not debate. This is derailment. It's the rhetorical equivalent of throwing sand in your eyes. And the longer you stay, the more you lose. Not because they've proven you wrong, but because you've exhausted yourself trying to follow a trail that was never meant to lead anywhere. Seneca warned us with brutal accuracy, "He who is everywhere is nowhere." That truth applies not only to how we live, but how we argue. If you allow yourself to chase every tangent, every emotional breadcrumb, every irrelevant thread they toss at you, you dissolve your own clarity. You stop being a thinker. You become a defender of everything and nothing. And that's exactly what they want. Because the more confused you are, the easier it is for them to retreat without admitting defeat. They'll say, well, this conversation is going nowhere. They'll act like you're the one being difficult. They'll accuse you of being stuck on the past when it was they who dragged it in. They'll end the exchange not with a resolution, but with exhaustion. And somehow they'll frame that as your fault. The Stoic, however, does not chase distractions. He does not follow red herrings into rhetorical mazes. He recognizes the moment the conversation has shifted from substance to strategy. And when that moment arrives, he chooses one of two paths. He calmly brings the focus back, or he walks away entirely. He does not explain himself into a corner. He does not feel guilty for holding the line. He does not equate patience with tolerance for nonsense. Because the Stoic knows that time is finite. Focus is sacred, and anyone who treats either carelessly does not deserve the dignity of your full attention. There is no virtue in indulging irrelevance. There is no strength in sticking it out just to appear composed. Wisdom lies in discernment, in the ability to say, no, that's not the topic, that's not what we're doing here. And when that fails, strength lies in knowing that silence is not surrender. It is sovereignty. A man who cannot stay on topic is not seeking truth. He is seeking relief from scrutiny, from contradiction, from the discomfort of actually having to back up his beliefs. He wants the argument to dissolve into chaos because chaos cannot be measured, cannot be won or lost. It just spreads. And if you stay in that storm long enough, you'll find yourself responding to things you never said, defending ideas you don't believe, and wondering how you ended up explaining yourself for the 50th time when your first answer was already enough. That is not Stoic. That is self-betrayal. The Stoic protects his time like his sanity depends on it. Because it does. He does not run from conversation. He engages fully when the exchange is genuine. But when it turns into a maze with no exit, he chooses the door. Quietly, without drama, without apology. Because truth doesn't need to chase chaos. And clarity never needs to shout over noise. So the next time someone starts derailing the conversation, don't follow. Don't answer their side quests. Don't take the bait. Hold the thread, or walk away with it still in your hands. Because there is one more tactic left, one more sign that tells you, beyond all doubt, that this argument was never about learning, never about reason, never about finding common ground. It was always about one thing, winning. And that's the final fatal sign. Sign 6, they think winning is everything. Some people don't argue to explore truth. They don't engage to learn, to clarify, to sharpen their understanding. They argue for one reason only, to win. It doesn't matter what the topic is: politics, parenting, diet, business, the color of the sky. What matters is that, in the end, you yield, that you fold, stutter, backpedal, or walk away with your shoulders low and your point forgotten. That you lose, because for them, that's the goal. And the worst part? They don't even care how they win. They'll twist your words, redefine the terms mid-sentence, demand impossible precision from you while offering none in return. They'll bait you, provoke you, derail, deflect, insult, and pretend to be the injured party, all just to tilt the ground beneath your feet long enough for you to stumble. To them, an argument isn't a space for discovery, it's a battlefield. And they don't want dialogue, they want domination. That's not intelligence, that's insecurity, because the person who truly knows where they stand doesn't fear scrutiny. He doesn't need to win every exchange to prove his worth. He speaks with strength because his sense of self isn't hanging on the outcome of the conversation. But these people, these pseudo-debaters addicted to victory, they treat every disagreement as a threat to their ego. And when the ego is fragile, it will do anything to avoid the unbearable experience of being wrong, even if that means destroying the conversation entirely. This is where the Stoic draws his hardest boundary. He does not enter contests disguised as dialogue. He does not lend his clarity to battles that have already been rigged, because he understands something most people never learn. Truth doesn't require a winner. Seneca once wrote, "He who is brave is free." Free from what? From the need to prove, from the hunger for approval, from the desperation to always come out on top. The Stoic is brave enough to be corrected. He is secure enough to say, "I hadn't considered that." He is strong enough to change his position when the truth demands it. And because of that strength, he has no need to crush others beneath the weight of his certainty. But the person obsessed with winning has no such freedom. They are enslaved by the need to appear infallible. They cannot afford humility because humility would mean admitting that their self-worth isn't built on dominance. And without dominance, they fear they are nothing, so they fight endlessly, even when the point is lost, even when the facts are against them, even when no one is watching. Especially then, because the only audience they're really performing for is themselves. It's exhausting to engage with them. Not because they're sharp, but because they refuse to relent. They grind down the conversation until there's nothing left but noise and tension and the bitter aftertaste of a war that never needed to happen. And if you're not careful, they'll drag you into their game. They'll bait you into scoring points, into parrying every jab, into proving that you are right. And suddenly, you're not seeking clarity anymore. You're seeking victory, just like them. And the moment that happens, you've already lost. Because the Stoic doesn't argue to win. He argues to understand. He listens with intent, speaks with precision, and holds his positions with grace, but never at the cost of his peace. And when he realizes the other person is not here for the truth, but only for the trophy, he does the bravest, freest, and rarest thing a man can do. He walks away. He doesn't slam the door. He doesn't throw a parting insult. He doesn't need the last word. Because the Stoic knows you don't need to defeat someone in conversation to win the moment. You just need to keep your clarity. You just need to preserve your dignity. And sometimes that means letting them believe they've won while you carry the truth quietly, intact, untouched. The man who always has to win is a prisoner of his own weakness. But the man who can lose the argument and still walk away stronger, that man is untouchable. Because he didn't come for victory, he came for truth. And if truth is not welcome, he doesn't beg for space. He leaves, not in defeat, but in mastery. Because sometimes the most stoic thing you can do is walk away without saying a word. Conclusion: choose peace over provocation. In the end, it's not about who shouted louder. It's not about who got the last word. And it sure as hell isn't about who walked away feeling victorious. The Stoic doesn't enter arguments to dominate, to perform, or to humiliate. He enters, when necessary, to seek truth, calmly, clearly, and with the kind of strength that doesn't rely on volume or venom to be felt. And when he sees the signs that the other person is not listening, not thinking, not willing, He chooses the only path that protects what truly matters: his peace, his clarity, his self-respect. Because to be dragged into an ego battle is to lose by participation. To let someone bait you into rage is to hand them the reins to your mind. And to argue with those who are committed to misunderstanding you is not noble. It is foolish. The Stoic understands that truth doesn't need to scream. It doesn't beg to be accepted. It doesn't crumble under pressure. So he refuses to trade his composure for a hollow win. He lets others spiral, perform, manipulate, deflect, while he remains still. Because he knows you do not owe your energy to chaos, your reason to noise, or your dignity to fools. The strongest man in the room is rarely the loudest. He's the one who knows when to speak and when to simply walk away. If this message hits somewhere deep, if you've felt the fatigue of arguing with the unteachable, the unchanging, the emotionally manipulative, then maybe you're finally ready to stop playing their game and start playing yours. Subscribe True Stoic Way for unapologetic, Stoic wisdom that doesn't sugarcoat the truth. Comment below, I choose clarity over comfort, because peace isn't passive, it's power, and it belongs to those brave enough to walk away with their mind and their dignity intact.